The office door was still swinging when Ryan Mitchell stepped through it. Behind him, a young woman hurried past with a box of belongings, eyes red, not looking back. Grace Sutton sat with her back to the window, wheelchair angled toward the harbor light, and she didn't turn around. "You have 30 seconds, she said, "before I do to you what I just did to him." Ryan set his bag down slow, said nothing. When she finally turned the chair to face him, something in her stopped cold, like she'd seen him somewhere before and couldn't place where. "Keep this one running. There's a detail early on, a photograph on a desk, that won't mean anything until the very end." The agency had warned him. 11 aides in 14 months. Some quit after a week. One quit after a single afternoon, walked out still wearing his coat. Ryan hadn't asked why. He needed the hours, the benefits, and a schedule that let him pick up his daughter by 4:30. And Sutton Industries paid enough that he didn't have to ask questions he couldn't afford the answers to. Grace's assistant walked him through the routine in clipped sentences. Morning physical therapy at 7. Correspondence review at 8. She did not like to be touched without warning. She did not like to be spoken to like a patient. She did not, under any circumstance, like to be helped unless she asked first. He learned the rules fast, and he broke none of them. He learned the layout of the house, too, without being told, which hallway carried sound and which didn't, where the ramp had been retrofitted into a staircase that used to be grand and now just looked apologetic. He never mentioned any of it. He just moved through the house like a man used to memorizing terrain before anyone asked him to. Morning started at 6:30 with physical therapy in a converted sunroom overlooking the garden. Grace working through resistance bands and transfers with a discipline that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with refusing to let her body decide what she could do without her permission. Ryan spotted her, counted reps in a flat voice, and said nothing when her arms shook on the last set, because he understood, better than most people could, that pity was its own kind of insult. By the third day, Grace had started testing him the way she tested all of them, with requests built to be unreasonable. Reschedule 4 meetings in 10 minutes, find a supplier contract from 3 years back, with no file name, stand in the doorway while she took a call and not react to a word of it, no matter how sharp her voice got. Ryan did all of it without flinching, and without offering an opinion she hadn't asked for. At noon, he stepped into the hallway to call his daughter. "Homework first, then the tablet," he said, low, patient, the same tone twice. "I know it's boring. Do it anyway." He didn't know Grace could hear him through the half-open door until he turned and found her watching, her expression unguarded for exactly as long as it took her to notice she was doing it. Then it closed again, fast, like a blind pulled down. "Your daughter," she said. "Ava. She's 9. You call her every day?" "Every day I can." Grace looked away first. On the corner of her desk sat a small frame, turned face down, the kind of picture someone keeps but can't look at. Ryan noticed it because everything else on that desk was arranged with a precision that bordered on defensive, and that one object broke the pattern. He didn't ask about it. Not yet. Late in the afternoon, while he refilled her water without being asked, and without touching anything else, Grace studied him for a long moment. "What did you do before this?" she said. "Before wheeling rich women to meetings." "Different kind of work." "That's not an answer. It's the one I've got. Everyone who works for me has a resume I could recite in my sleep. Yours reads like it was written by someone trying not to be found." She said it lightly, testing the edge of it. "Maybe I was." Grace studied him a moment longer, then let it go, some instinct telling her this wasn't a door to force open. She didn't push, but she watched him leave that evening the way a person watches a door they're not sure will open again, and for the first time in longer than she could admit, she found herself hoping it would. By the end of the first week, Grace had stopped testing him the way she tested the others. She started testing him differently. She staged it carefully. A folder, accidentally left open with a fabricated timeline, a medication conflict, a fever spike that wasn't real. Timed for the exact hour her actual nurse was out. She watched from the corner of her eye as she described the symptoms, expecting hesitation or panic, or the kind of overcorrection that gave people away. Ryan crossed the room before she'd finished the sentence, and something in the way he moved changed entirely. Faster, lower to the ground, all the careful politeness of the last week gone in an instant. He checked pulse points that weren't part of any homemade training program. 2 fingers pressed flat against her wrist, and then her throat, his eyes going somewhere else for a second, somewhere clinical and far away. He asked questions in a sequence too precise to be guesswork, the kind of triage rhythm drilled into a person until it stopped being a decision and became reflex. Name, date, count backward from 100, squeeze my hand. There's no fever, he said finally, flat. And there's no crisis. You made this up. Grace didn't deny it. Who taught you that? The army. Which part of the army checks a civilian's pulse like that? He didn't answer right away, and the silence told her more than a resume would have. That night, after he left, Grace did something she rarely allowed herself. She looked him up, public service record, redacted in places, but enough. Army Special Forces. Combat Medic, designation 18 Delta. Commendations she didn't recognize the names of but understood the weight of. A discharge date 3 years back that came with no explanation attached. The next morning she confronted him with it laid open on her desk. You don't work in home care, she said. You survive it. Ryan looked at the page for a long moment, at the blacked-out lines and the commendation names he never talked about, before he answered. 18 Delta. 11 years. It's a job where you learn to keep people alive in places that don't want anyone alive. His voice stayed even, but his hands, folded in front of him, went still in the particular way hands go still when a man is holding something down. I left because I couldn't save the person I needed to save the most. Something in his voice closed the subject before she could ask who. Grace didn't push, not because she wasn't curious, but because she recognized the shape of a wound she carried herself, and she knew what it cost to have someone poke at it before you were ready. For the first time since he'd started, she looked at him not as staff, but as a person carrying something as heavy as her own. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was the first quiet between them that wasn't. Later, near the end of the day, Ryan noticed the small frame on her desk had shifted, just enough that the edge of an old photograph peeked out from underneath. Grace's hand moved before he could see more, flattening it back down without a word, her jaw tight in a way that told him not to ask. He filed it away, the same way he filed away everything he wasn't ready to understand yet, the way he'd once learned to file away the sound of a door closing on a hospital hallway, because some things only made sense once you had every piece, and he didn't have all of them. The following Tuesday, Ryan drove Grace downtown to the Sutton Industries headquarters near the river, a building of glass and old brick that had housed 3 generations of the family's shipping business. In the lobby, a man in a tailored suit fell into step beside them with the ease of someone who owned the floor. Gregory Nash, he said, extending a hand. Ryan shook once, briefly. Chief Operating Officer. You must be the new one. He said new one, the way a man refers to a piece of furniture he expects to be replaced soon. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did, not with staff. Ryan had spent 11 years learning to read men in the half-second before they decided whether you were worth their attention, and Nash decided quickly, sliding past him toward Grace with a warmth he hadn't bothered, extending to the man holding her chair steady in the elevator. In the elevator, with Grace a few steps ahead speaking to another executive, Nash lowered his voice. How's she doing? Really? Sleeping? Eating? Managing the stress? He said it like a man filling out a form, not a man who cared. You'd have to ask her, Ryan said. I'm asking you. Someone in your position sees things the rest of us don't. Then you're asking the wrong person. Nash's smile thinned but held. People in your position don't usually last long here, Mr. Mitchell. Something to keep in mind. He said it lightly, almost friendly, and stepped off the elevator before Ryan could answer, leaving the sentence to sit there like a hand on the shoulder. Ryan didn't mention it to Grace. Not yet. But he watched Nash differently after that, the way you watch a man who's just shown you, without meaning to, that he's used to being obeyed. Upstairs, the boardroom was already half full when they arrived. 6 directors, folders open, faces arranged into the particular blankness people wear right before they say something unkind. Grace wheeled to the head of the table herself, refusing help, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet around someone they're deciding whether to respect. Quarterly numbers are strong, one director said, but the board has concerns about continuity of leadership. Given the circumstances, Grace didn't blink. Say what you mean. Nobody did. Not directly. They talked around the word incapacity for 40 minutes, dressing it in language about optics and investor confidence, about how the shipping insurance underwriters had raised questions this quarter about stability the market wanted to see. Grace answered every question with numbers, cold and exact, quarterly margins, port throughput, contracts signed under her name in the last 18 months, never raising her voice, never once looking like she needed anyone in that room to like her. Ryan stood by the door the whole time, arms crossed, watching through the glass. He had spent years reading people under pressure, soldiers holding it together on the worst day of their lives, and he recognized the specific kind of exhaustion in Grace's face, the exhaustion of someone who had been proving herself for 6 straight years with no one standing behind her. When the meeting ended, she wheeled out without a word, spine straight, and didn't say anything until they were back in the car. "They do that every quarter," she said, staring out the window. "Some version of it. You handled it. I always handle it." A pause. "That's not the same as it not costing anything." Ryan didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded. Once, the way you nod at someone who doesn't want to be told it's going to be okay, only that you heard them. It was, she realized later, the first time in years someone had let her be tired without trying to fix it. Rain came in hard that Thursday, the kind that shut down half the city by 5 o'clock. Ryan's usual arrangement for Ava fell through. A sitter stuck on the wrong side of a flooded underpass, and he made the call he hated making, the one where he had to choose between the job and his daughter. Grace answered it differently than he expected. "Bring her here." "That's not." "Bring her here, Ryan." It was the first time she'd used his first name. Ava arrived soaked to the knees, backpack dripping on the marble floor of the Bull Street house, staring up at the ceiling like she'd walked into a museum. She didn't stare at the wheelchair the way adults sometimes did, carefully, guiltily. She just walked straight up to it. "Does it go fast?" she asked. "Faster than you'd think," Grace said. "Can I push it?" "No. But you can sit in my lap while I do." Ryan watched from the kitchen doorway as his daughter shrieked with laughter down the hallway. Grace's hands steady on the wheels, her face doing something he hadn't seen it do before, something unguarded and entirely unbothered by who was watching. The housekeeper, passing through with a tray, stopped in the hall to watch too, then kept walking without a word, like she understood better than to interrupt it. Later, while Grace answered emails at the kitchen table and Ava dried her hair with a towel too big for her, Ava asked, with the bluntness only a 9-year-old could manage, "Does it hurt, not being able to walk?" Ryan started to redirect the question, but Grace held up a hand, unbothered. "Not the way you mean. It's more like learning a whole new language for the same sentences. Some days I forget I even need the translation." Ava considered this with total seriousness. "That's a good answer. I've had 6 years to practice it." Later, at the table, Ava pulled out a marker and a folded piece of paper and drew, with the confident inaccuracy of a 9-year-old, a wheelchair with wings on it. She slid it across the table without ceremony. "So you can fly when the stairs are dumb," she said. Grace held it a long moment, longer than a piece of paper should take to hold, and something crossed her face that Ryan had never once seen there in 3 weeks of watching her run a company. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't quite steady. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." She said it on the corner of the desk, not the drawer, the desk, propped against the frame that was always turned face down. For the first time, the two objects sat side by side, the hidden past and the unguarded present, and neither of them moved to hide either one. Ryan noticed. He didn't say anything, but driving home that night, with Ava asleep against the window and the wipers going, he found himself thinking about a woman who ran a shipping company with the same precision she used to guard a photograph she couldn't bear to look at, and wondering, for the first time, what was in it. The rain had stopped, but the streets still carried that washed, silver look, and he drove slower than he needed to, in no hurry to let the evening end. The insurance department sent the notice on a Monday, routine language for something that wasn't routine at all. A 7-year mandatory audit of fleet maintenance records, beginning with the oldest files on the schedule. Nobody in the building thought twice about it except one man, and he read it twice, then a third time, standing very still in his office with the door closed. Gregory Nash had spent 6 years making sure certain records aged out quietly. 6 years ago, as vice president of operations, he'd delayed a mandatory brake inspection across the company fleet to hit a quarterly budget target, buried the engineering memo that flagged the risk, and told himself it was a formality not a decision that would matter. It had gotten him a promotion that year, a bonus tied to margins nobody thought to question. He had been telling himself it didn't matter for 6 years, the way a man tells himself a lot of things, when the alternative is admitting what he actually did, and each year the promotion made it a little easier to keep believing it. Now the audit would reach back exactly far enough to find it. He called his attorney that afternoon, and by evening, a different document was already being drafted, quietly, under a header that had nothing to do with fleet maintenance. A petition. Guardianship. Language about sustained psychological strain, about a pattern of erratic staffing turnover, about a company that deserved stable leadership during a period of, the draft said, ongoing personal difficulty. Denise Marlowe found the draft by accident, left open on a shared printer queue she wasn't meant to see. She was the family's private nurse now, but for 11 years before, that she'd run the emergency department where Grace was brought in the night of the accident, and something about the guardianship petition's date range, 6 years back, made her stomach turn in a way she didn't examine too closely at first. She read it twice, then she thought about a chart she'd been told, gently but firmly, not to finish writing that same night 6 years ago, by a hospital administrator who mentioned, almost in passing, how much the Sutton family had given the hospital that year. She said nothing to Grace that evening. She wasn't ready. Instead, she said only this, standing in the doorway as Grace reviewed correspondence. Be careful who you trust on that board. Not all of them are as loyal as they act. Grace looked up, surprised by the weight in it. Which one? Denise didn't answer. She left the question hanging, the way a person leaves a door open a crack instead of pushing it all the way, because she wasn't brave enough yet to walk through it herself. That night, Grace didn't sleep. Ryan found her at the window near midnight, chair turned toward the dark shape of the river, the lights of Talmadge Bridge strung out over the water like something from a dream she couldn't wake from. You're not going to bed, he said. Not a question. I don't sleep well when it rains. He was quiet a moment. Something happened on that bridge. Grace's hand tightened on the armrest. She didn't answer, not that night, but she didn't tell him to leave either. And he stood beside her a long time, not touching her, not filling the silence with anything she hadn't asked for, until the rain eased and she finally wheeled herself back toward the hallway. Ask me again sometime, she said, without turning around. Not tonight. He would. Sooner than either of them expected, it came 3 nights later, without warning, the way the truth sometimes arrives when a person has finally run out of the strength it takes to keep holding it back. Grace was at her desk when Ryan asked again, gently, and this time she didn't deflect. She told him about the bridge, about the rain that night 6 years ago, about driving alone across Talmadge because her own car was in the shop and she'd borrowed one from the company fleet in a hurry to bring her father a set of numbers that didn't add up. She told him about the brakes failing without warning, the guardrail giving way like paper, the water coming up fast and black and cold enough to stop thought entirely. There was a man, she said, a stranger. He was already in the water before I understood what was happening. The car filled up faster than you'd think. I remember the cold more than the fear, how it seemed to arrive before the panic did. He got me out. He did things to keep me alive that I didn't understand until much later. Pressure in places, words in my ear telling me to stay with him, stay awake, and then he was gone before anyone else arrived. Nobody ever found out who he was. I spent the first year after convinced I'd dreamed him. Her hand went to the drawer, and this time she didn't stop herself. She lifted the frame and turned it over, finally, after 6 years, and set it on the desk between them. A photograph, blurred, taken by a stranger's phone from the far end of the bridge, showing only the back of a man carrying a woman up out of the mud, water streaming off both of them in the glare of emergency lights. Ryan went very still. On the man's forearm, faint but unmistakable even in the grain of a bad photograph, was a tattoo, the unit crest he'd carried on his own arm for 11 years. Before he could speak, the door opened. Denise stood there, a folder in her hand she'd meant to bring in and now forgot entirely, staring at the photograph, then at Ryan, then back at the photograph. I recognized him the first week, Denise said quietly, the folder still forgotten in her hand. I didn't say anything because I wasn't allowed to say anything. I was the nurse on duty the night they brought you in, Grace. I was the one who treated him too. Off the record, in the hallway. before he disappeared out the side entrance, a gash on his forearm he wouldn't let anyone log. I remember thinking, that man is going to walk out of here, and nobody is ever going to know what he did tonight. Her voice cracked. I've known for 3 weeks and I couldn't find the courage to be the one to tell you. I kept telling myself it wasn't my story to hand over. Grace looked up at Ryan, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Is it you? She finally said, barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't answer with words. He crossed the room, knelt beside the chair so they were level, and nodded once, slow, like a confession that had been 6 years in the making. Grace's breath left her in a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite relief. Some third thing that didn't have a clean name. The story didn't end with the nod. It only opened a door onto a longer one, and Ryan, still kneeling, still holding her eyes, understood that the hardest part of it was his to tell. I wasn't out for a walk that night, he said. I was driving to the hospital. My wife, Laura, she'd been sick a long time by then, cancer. And that night things had turned fast. I was 40 minutes from her when I saw your car go through the rail. He stopped, jaw working, the words costing him more than any of the physical things he'd ever done for a living. I didn't think. I just went in after you, did what I was trained to do, kept you breathing until the paramedics could take over. And then I left before anyone could stop me and ask questions, because every minute I stood there answering them was a minute I wasn't with her. He looked down at his own hands, like they still remembered it. I've pulled men out of worse water than that river, and never once had to choose between them and my own family. That night I did, and I've never been sure I chose right. You made it in time, Grace said. It wasn't quite a question. I made it, but not in time for the decision they needed made about her surgery. My sister had to make it instead, because I was still on the road. Laura made it through that night. She held on 3 more years, but I've never been sure if those 40 minutes changed anything for her, and I'll never get to know for certain, and that's the part that doesn't go away. Grace's hand found his, slow, deliberate, the first time either of them had reached for the other without a reason attached to the job. I'm alive because of those 40 minutes, she said. I don't know how to carry that next to what it cost you. You don't carry it, Ryan said. We do. Together, or not at all. Grace looked at him then the way she hadn't let herself look at anyone in 6 years, without the armor she wore into boardrooms, without the practiced distance she kept between herself and every person who'd ever tried to help her. 6 years, she said. I built a whole life around not needing anyone, and it turns out the reason I'm alive to build it is a man who needed someone he couldn't get to in time. That's not a debt, Grace. I know. It's something else. I just don't have a word for it yet. For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain had started again outside, soft this time, tapping the window in a rhythm that felt less like grief and more like company. Denise quietly excused herself, leaving the folder on the side table, understanding that whatever was happening in that room belonged only to the 2 people inside it. When Grace finally spoke again, her voice had changed, steadier, sharper, the voice of a woman remembering she ran a company. If Denise was told to hide what she saw that night, someone gave that order. And if someone at this company delayed the maintenance that caused my brakes to fail, that person is still walking around a building with my name on it. Ryan looked at the folder Denise had left behind, still unopened on the table. Then we find out who. They stayed up past midnight, going through what records Grace still had access to, cross-referencing maintenance logs against the fleet vehicle she'd driven that night, building a timeline neither of them had wanted to need. Somewhere in that quiet work, hand occasionally brushing hand over the same page, something settled between them that didn't require a name yet, only the certainty that neither one was going to let go of it now. 3 days later, Nash brought the guardianship petition formally before the board, framing it in the gentlest language his lawyers could produce. A temporary transfer of operational authority out of concern for Grace's well-being given, he said, the emotional strain of recent revelations about her accident. He'd rehearsed the delivery, warm and reluctant, a man supposedly forced into an unpleasant duty by his devotion to the company. He said the word revelations like it was evidence of instability rather than evidence against himself, and for the first 10 minutes, watching the directors nod along, it almost worked. Denise stood up before anyone could vote. I was the charge nurse the night Grace Sutton was brought into my emergency room, she said, her voice shaking at first and then not. "The injuries I documented that night were consistent with total brake failure, not driver error. I was told, by hospital administration, that language to that effect should not appear in the final chart, given the size of the Sutton family's contributions to that hospital. I have carried that instruction for 6 years. I'm done carrying it." The room went silent in a way it hadn't for any of Nash's arguments. Ryan stepped forward next, a folder in his hand. "This is a maintenance authorization log from 6 years ago. It shows a scheduled brake inspection for the company fleet, postponed under a signature that matches records I've cross-checked against current personnel files." He set it on the table in front of the board, not raising his voice, letting the paper do what his words didn't need to. "The signature is Gregory Nash's." Nash's composure didn't crack all at once. It went piece by piece, a denial that came out too fast, a correction that contradicted the denial, a third explanation that contradicted both. The directors who had spent the morning ready to strip Grace of her authority were, by the end of it, watching Nash instead, the way a room watches a man they've just realized they never actually knew. Grace didn't say much. She didn't need to. She wheeled herself to the head of the table, waited for the room to quiet, and spoke in the same even voice she'd used through 6 years of quarterly meetings designed to make her feel like she didn't belong in it. "I built this company back from the day my father couldn't anymore," she said. "I did it from this chair, in this voice, with no one behind me most of the time. I'm not asking this board to decide whether I'm capable. I'm telling you I already have been, for 6 years, while the man across this table was hoping I never found out why I was in this chair at all." The board voted down the guardianship petition before the hour was out, and it wasn't close. Nash remained in the room until the final count, his name still on the door down the hall. Still, for one more day, a man with keys to the building. Nash reached Ryan alone in the parking garage that evening, waiting by his truck in a way that made it clear he'd chosen the spot deliberately. "You've made an enemy today," Nash said, quiet, controlled, the friendliness gone entirely from his voice now. "A man in your position, no real standing here, a kid to think about, should consider how easily a story like yours gets rewritten. Unstable veteran inserts himself into a vulnerable woman's life, feeds her a fabricated connection to a 6-year-old accident for sympathy. It writes itself, Mr. Mitchell." Ryan didn't move, didn't raise his voice. "You threatened my daughter. I mentioned her. There's a difference, if you're smart about it. I've had people point actual weapons at me and mean it less than you just did." Ryan opened his truck door, unhurried. "You should have spent the last 6 years fixing what you broke instead of hiding it. Now you don't get to choose how this ends." He drove home that night, with his hands steady on the wheel, and his mind entirely made up. The following morning, Ryan brought everything he had left to Grace's attorney before the board reconvened. Recorded conversations from 2 former aides Nash had quietly pressured out of the household over the years, financial records showing payments routed through a shell vendor to discourage a whistleblower complaint filed 3 years earlier and buried, and Nash's own words from the parking garage saved on Ryan's phone from the moment he'd realized what kind of man he was dealing with. The board reconvened by noon, faces tighter than the day before. Grace laid it out herself this time, page by page, without raising her voice once, because by then she didn't need to. She walked them through the shell vendor payments, the dates that lined up with the whistleblower complaint that had gone nowhere. The audio from the parking garage played once, in full, in a room gone completely silent. Nobody asked her to stop. Nobody defended him. The room had already decided. The vote to remove Gregory Nash as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, and to refer the maintenance and cover-up findings to federal insurance investigators, passed with only one dissent, and it wasn't his, because by then he'd already been asked to leave the room. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it again. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket the way a man does when he still wants to look like he's in control of something, and walked out ahead of security instead of waiting to be walked. Security escorted him out through the lobby he'd once walked like he owned it. He didn't look at anyone on the way, not the directors, not the assistants who'd watched him for years, not Ryan, who stood near the door and let him pass without a word, because there was nothing left worth saying to a man on his way out. Grace wheeled out of the boardroom behind him, and for the first time in 6 years, She didn't wait for anyone to open the door or offer to push her through it. She crossed the lobby on her own power, chin level, and the people in that building who had watched her prove herself for 6 straight years finally understood they were watching something they should have recognized a long time ago. Ava was waiting by the elevators with the receptionist, swinging her legs on a lobby bench, and the moment she saw her father, she ran the last 10 feet and threw her arms around his waist. Grace watched them for a second longer than she meant to, something open and unguarded crossing her face, the same look Ryan had caught once through a half-open door and never forgotten. "You did that," Ryan said to her, quiet, just for her. "We did that," Grace said. His hand found hers on the armrest of the chair, brief, unhurried, the kind of touch that doesn't need a sentence attached to it to mean something. Ava, still holding onto her father's leg, looked up at both of them and grinned like she already understood something they hadn't said out loud yet. 3 weeks later, Grace asked Ryan to drive her somewhere she hadn't been in 6 years. Talmadge Bridge in late afternoon light looked nothing like it had that night. Dry pavement instead of driving rain, the low sun turning the river gold instead of black. Container ships moved slow and enormous beneath the span, the same kind of ships that had built the Sutton family fortune 3 generations back, and for a moment Grace watched one pass the way a person watches something that has nothing to do with them anymore. Grace had her chair rolled to the rail, close enough to see the water but not so close it felt like a dare, and Ava ran ahead along the walkway, chasing gulls, her laughter carrying back down the span, bright and ordinary, against a place that had once held nothing but the worst night of 2 lives. Ryan stood beside the chair, one hand resting on the rail, not on her, giving her the space to decide how close to get to the memory on her own terms. He'd learned that about her by now, that the kindest thing he could offer most days wasn't help. It was room. "I used to think I'd never come back here," Grace said. "You don't have to stay long. I want to." She reached into her bag and pulled out the old photograph, the blurred one that had sat face down on her desk for 6 years, and held it out to him. "I kept this because I needed a name for the person who saved me. I spent 6 years wondering who he was." Ryan took it, looked at it a long moment. The grainy image of a man he barely recognized as himself anymore. "Now, I don't need the photograph," Grace said. "I have you." He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket instead of handing it back, and neither of them explained why that felt like the right thing to do with it. "What happens now?" Ryan asked. "With the company, with the investigation, federal insurance auditors will take a year to say what everyone already knows. Nash will lose more than a job. I'll spend the next 6 years fixing what he broke instead of pretending the chair is the only thing he cost me." She looked out at the water a while longer. "But that's tomorrow's work. I didn't bring you here to talk about tomorrow." "Why did you bring me here?" "Because I spent 6 years avoiding this bridge like it was the accident itself. Like the water did this to me instead of a man in a suit who decided a budget mattered more than a brake line." She turned the chair slightly, so she was facing him instead of the river. "I wanted the last time I came here to mean something better than the first." Ava's voice carried up the walkway, calling for them to come look at something in the water, and Grace laughed. A real one. Easy. Nothing guarded in it at all. Ryan released the brake on her chair and walked beside her toward his daughter, the two of them moving at exactly the same pace, matched without either of them trying to be. They stood at the rail together as the sun dropped lower over the harbor, Ava between them pointing out a heron picking through the shallows, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all because nothing needed saying. The light went from gold to something closer to copper. The ships kept moving slow beneath them toward the sea, and Savannah settled into evening the way it always had, indifferent to the two people who had just decided, without a single word passing between them, that they were done being alone. Neither of them said the word love that afternoon. They didn't need to. The bridge that had taken 6 years from her, and 40 minutes that never stopped costing him, had finally given something back, quietly, without ceremony, in the shape of two people walking the same direction at last.